So can a company be both equitable and apolitical? Is the chasm between those who see Silicon Valley as a meritocracy and those who are willing to call out its inequities growing larger? Is there a quiet backlash against last year's racial justice movements happening at technology companies? These are some of the questions that we're going to talk about on today's episode of the PRovoke Media podcast. To have this conversation, we have Charles Hudson on the show. Charles is managing partner and founder of Precursor Ventures, an early stage venture capital firm. Charles has been in Silicon Valley since the mid-90s, attending Stanford for undergrad and grad school, and then building a career in venture capital. Also, we're happy to welcome back to this show, Syreeta Mussante, who has worked in tech PR here in Silicon Valley for more than 3 decades, leading agencies and teams. She's now EVP of B2B and Enterprise Tech at Praytel. And this show is part of our groundbreaking series, Intersection, which I will link to in the show notes. Welcome, Charles and Syreeta.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, well, I mean, Syreeta, I'm thrilled to bring you back. And Charles, I'm so excited to have you on the show. And Charles, I want to sort of start with you, because you've been out here for a long time and you know firsthand how much Silicon Valley's culture is built around this idea of meritocracy. But even as early as I think it was 2013, I saw a Wired article that called it out as not a meritocracy, but like dangerous hero worship. And then I think in 2016, I think The Atlantic even did a story where women were challenging this as well. So I'm curious if you had ever bought into this idea that Silicon Valley was a meritocracy, and when or how did that shift?
I mean, I definitely, in my early career, largely believed that. And I think it depends on your perspective when you're in the room. I think if you're a man from the subset of schools that tends to end up having people in venture capital or leadership positions in tech, within your little bubble, it actually weirdly can feel quite fair. Like you're competing against a set of people that you think are all qualified, and there needs to be some rationalization for why does person A win when person B is like also qualified. So you need some narrative for how the sort of rewards of the system are allocated among people. And the meritocracy one is very convenient because it also allows for sort of the ability to explain arbitrary windfalls. Well, this person made a lot of money by starting this company because they had the foresight to see these market trends, not that they were just lucky or happened to be well placed.
Okay.
And I think it wasn't until I started looking around and saying, like, maybe it feels fair if you're on the playing field competing for capital. Like if you're just allocating capital to men, then it is easy to say, well, we're allocating capital to the strongest male teams that come into our office. It doesn't really beg the question of like, well, why are only male teams getting to the partner meeting? Why are only white people getting the opportunity to raise money? When I started looking around and saying, well, why am I the only person who looks like me in many of these rooms, in many of these conversations, I think I realized that like I am one of the only people in this room. And the reason why I think has a lot to do with where I went to school and where I worked. And like, there's a bunch of check boxes that if you're a person of color or woman, if you can sort of accumulate some of these merit badges, you will find yourself in these rooms. And I think you'll oftentimes find yourself as the only person. And what I would say maybe 10 years ago is I think there wasn't a recognition about what it feels like or what it looks like to be in one of those rooms when you're not part of the dominant group. And I think what's shifting in the conversation, why this is difficult, is the people that were maybe once the only person in the room are now one of a small group. And I think they're trying to force the people who are sort of the more dominant group to reflect on like, well, why is the room, how did the room composition end up this way? Because if it's truly based on merit and ability, you're essentially saying that women and people of color don't have the talent.
Yeah. Syreeta, you've been out here almost as long as Charles has been. What's your take on this? And did you ever have that moment, or as a woman of color, was your experience different?
I think it took me a long time to really register why the things were happening. I was very aware that I was the only woman of color in the room. But I tended to be surrounded by white liberals who were my friends and who, you know, and it was kind of like, well, I'm not really sure about why this is happening. And I think, you know, just like everybody, everybody else, you want to think the best of your coworkers and your colleagues and the people who become your friends. I don't think there's anything intentional happening. And I think that's where some of that defensiveness comes in, some of that resistance to the conversation comes in, because there are a lot of very good people who don't want it to be the way it is. But until they understand that they have to take action, as well as sort of me taking action to change things, you know, we're all sort of complicit. I think for me, I had a moment where I worked with a company out of San Francisco, and they had a chief strategy officer who was a woman of color. She was probably, I don't know, like 4'7", and was usually in charge when she was in the room at work. And she and I had a conversation about sort of about this loosely, and she said, you know, how many times we're in that room together and people say, you know, someone will say, okay, well, we should get started, and they turn sort of to the tallest kind of white dude in the room with the assumption that he's going to start the meeting. Or someone will ask her, you know, if she could bring in the snacks, and not think anything of it, right? And not think that might be offensive, or that might be inappropriate, or or even just to think you genuinely don't know who's in charge. You can't judge that from the outside of the person. So I think I had a moment with her where we really said, you know, like, this is not, you have to find a path. We have to walk the line between being understanding that the people around you may not intentionally mean you any harm, right? May not intentionally be trying to perpetuate a racist scenario, and also being cognizant of the fact that they are complicit.
Right. Yeah. And I think you raise a really great point about, you know, when you have organizations where folks see themselves as progressive and open-minded, some of the blind spots that can arise from that. And if we have time, we'll maybe circle back to that. But I do want to take a moment to talk about how VC money is distributed, right? I mean, and again, Charles, correct me if these numbers are dated, but from what I last saw, I think about 18% of VCs were women, 3% were Black, 1% were Latino, and for every $10 of VC money that goes to startups, nine of those go to startups led by men. So how do you talk about equity in a climate like this?
I think something Syreeta said is really important, which is why I think the tech industry has struggled with this issue so much, is I think for a long time, tech has positioned itself as like, we are an industry that's different than others. We're better, we're higher minded, we're capitalists, but we're motivated to make the world a better place, and technology is going to deliver this better future. We're not Philip Morris, we're not some fossil fuel company polluting the environment. We're like this better, more utopian industry. And I think when you have that self-perception, it makes criticism, particularly self-criticism, difficult. And so I think in many things in business, including venture-backed companies, we're very focused on the outcomes. So if your VP of sales came to you and said, Aarti, I tried really hard to make my number this quarter. I made a bunch of calls. I talked to a lot of customers. I just didn't close enough sales, but like, I'm on it. Next quarter, I'm on it. That VP of sales would not last very long. In venture, people say, hey, we're looking for qualified female candidates and people of color, and like the numbers aren't changing, but we are working super hard. And I just, at some point in my career, said, like, what if we just took away intent and looked at outcomes and just said, like, well, what's happening? And I'd argue the business facts that you outline suggest an industry that's not interested in funding women or people of color. For some reason, those people aren't getting access. Now, there could be a bunch of like self-serving rationalizations. Well, their ideas aren't as good. And we're in the business of funding the best ideas. So the reason they're not getting money is that like their ideas don't count. Well, then the question is like, well, who's judging the merit of these people and their ideas? And I think back on a lot of the things that I took for granted when I got into venture capital that were accepted facts that feel like cringy now. Like I definitely sat on a number of panels in the early 2010s where VCs just like proudly proclaimed, hey, if you can't figure out how to connect to somebody on my network to get a warm introduction, like I just can't be bothered. I just can't. And that wasn't considered like offensive or exclusionary. That was in the category of like, that's just how venture capital works. I remember being on a panel where a guy said, I only want to invest in companies where I can ride my bicycle from the office to meet the founders. And I don't think this person meant that as an exclusionary comment. I think they were expressing a desire to have physical proximity to their companies, which is not like in and of itself a bad thing. It just dramatically, and this office happened to be on Sand Hill Road, it just dramatically limited playing field of who this person. So I think part of it is some of the constructs of venture, particularly pre-Zoom, pre-pandemic, really like you had to be in San Francisco. Both you had to live here and your company had to be here. You had to raise money here in person, which meant if you were in Atlanta or New York, a lot of expensive plane trips and flights out here. And I think a lot of the business was focused on what was convenient for the venture capitalist. And what's convenient for most investors is to invest in people who went to the school you went to, or that you know socially, or that you know professionally, in a domain that you understand, serving a customer where you have some priors. And one thing I learned really quickly is I've met a lot of venture capitalists who don't have meaningful social or professional interaction with people of color, male or female. They live in communities where those people aren't well represented. They work in venture firms where those people aren't well represented. Their children attend schools where those backgrounds aren't well represented, and their portfolios don't contain founders of those. So I'm like, how on earth are these people ever going to feel comfortable with no connectivity whatsoever to people of color and to some extent women? I think part of what's happened on the gender front is I think more investors have more contact with women in a professional context.
Mhm.
And so it's harder to other women founders when you might be married to one, or you might have one in your portfolio. I think it's easier to other founders of color when you have almost no contact with people from their communities.
Right. And I think it's so interesting, both of you are talking about sort of this intention versus outcome. And I do think both, the tech industry and the PR industry has been so focused on intention for so long that, you have these well-meaning leaders who, will say the right things, right? But the outcomes and the results aren't being shown. And I want to acknowledge that when we're talking about people of color, we are talking most specifically about Black and Latino, because one of the things I've heard in Silicon Valley, right, as well, we have like Asians or we have Indians represented, right, and they're not an underrepresented group. The underrepresented groups are Black and Latino, and I want to make sure that we acknowledge that, so we're not just painting a broad brush. So let's talk then. So we've talked about sort of the startup space. Let's talk about some of these more established companies and what happened recently. We look at Coinbase and Basecamp, right? Both companies sort of decided that they were apolitical and they didn't want to have some of these messy conversations that we all had in 2020 around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, I think both companies sort of framed it and positioned it differently. And, there's some great journalism around both, and I will link to those in the show notes. But it made me wonder about, are there companies taking a more tacit approach to adopting these policies? And, the fatigue is real, right? There is a real backlash to some of the really difficult conversations that were had in 2020. Charles, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think one thing I've always, at least in the last few years, realized is like tech is not above society. The tech and venture industry has the same issues that our society has, and I think as a country we still have a hard time reckoning with our racial past. And until we've come up with a better way to address that, these conversations are always going to be fraught because there's a segment of society that like just doesn't want to have the conversation, wants the issue to go away. And I'm not surprised that these these topics are spilling over into the workplace, because I'd argue like people aren't getting very much relief on these topics and conversations from the political process. Not much is happening in Congress. So the only group you can effectively lobby is your employer. And employers, particularly in this labor market, I think are responsive. But I think part of what you're seeing is, I think some of this reflexively was like, hey, this George Floyd thing's a big deal. We should probably like create space for this conversation. And I feel like people thought, well, we're just going to contain the blast radius to this conversation around George Floyd. I think what they didn't realize is there was a lot of hurt and pent-up frustration just underneath the surface, and creating a little bit of space to talk about one incident really opened the pressure release valve for some of these other things that have been simmering under the surface to come out. And I don't think companies were prepared. I think they're like, hey, we want to have a discrete conversation about this one man who was murdered, and then we kind of want to go back to business as usual. And I don't think they realize that when you loosen that pressure valve, other things are going to come out that you have to deal with. And I think companies can choose to not engage with these issues. I think it's interesting that the companies that have chosen not to engage with these issues are led by people for whom these issues are not personal. And so I think it's one thing when you're like, this is an abstract issue that doesn't affect me, my loved ones, or my life. I can say this is something that's not appropriate for work, but I'd argue there's lots of silly things we talk about. We talk about pro football, we talk about Star Wars, we talk about lots of things at work that are not. We talk about succession. I mean, we talk about lots of things at work that are not work, but there's some things that are deemed like okay to talk about socially and culturally at companies. There's some things that aren't. And I understand where this discomfort's coming from, because I think a lot of people don't have the tools to have that conversation. And I think a lot of people are uncomfortable about where that conversation ultimately leads.
So I wanted to follow up on something that you did say about, about companies. People are looking to companies because they are more responsive, particularly in this labor market, than government. I mean, is there a recalibration around expectations and what companies, like what social problems they can solve? I felt like there was this big, movement towards purpose. I remember 2017, I definitely saw the pendulum swing really, really far towards, okay, well, Salesforce, come in and solve our problems, please. And there seems to be this gradual realization about the limitations of private companies and what they can do. And I'm curious to know how that's shaping out in terms of how companies are talking about purpose and addressing issues, social issues like this. And Syreeta or Charles, either one of you feel free to chime in here.
Well, I mean, I think it's a tough question. It's a big question. How are companies addressing these issues, right? I will say, you see some companies standing out and doing it, what you think, doing it right. HP comes to mind, right? With bringing on Leslie Slayton Brown to really like spearhead, not just, the lip service, but, their board is now half female, and like they seem to be walking the talk. And I think those are the kinds of changes, again, we talk back to outcomes, right? Those are the kinds of changes that we need to see. But I do think that, I remember being in a PR firm in 2014 when Ferguson happened, Michael Brown was killed, and the organization wanted to do the right thing, right? Wanted to create safe spaces to talk. That was the thing, right? Create safe. But if you have 3 people of color in an office, like it is a little bit difficult to create a safe space. And I remember coming into the office one day and literally getting into my office and having the 3 people of color in the office follow me in and close the door, right? And say like, we don't know how to deal with the fact that like this is all we're talking about at home and we can't talk about it here. And I said, well, as the only person of color on the leadership team, I felt empowered to talk about it, right? Because I was in a different place in my career. I didn't really have anyone to talk about it to, but I didn't feel the same kind of pain. And I took it to the group. And in bringing that up and explaining the challenge in having the conversation, for these folks, I found myself, tearing up and shaking. And I thought, okay, Syreeta, if you as a, you've been here for a while, these are your peers, they respect you, you are in a position of strength. If this is hard for you to bring up, how much harder is it for these people who are outside this leadership door? I don't know how companies are dealing with this effectively. I think we've seen it. I like to call it like I feel like it's a hype cycle, right? There's a bit of a racism hype cycle, and I think that as a country, we don't really have the ability to focus on more than one sort of one of these kind of groups at a time. So you saw, right? So you saw the sort of the Ferguson 2014 thing, and that was all we talked about. Everyone was releasing their numbers, right? And how do we tackle this? Companies felt forced to talk about this. And then you saw sort of it come down when Me Too started to happen, right? And we couldn't sustain both conversations. So we stopped talking about race and we started talking about women. And Lord knows we needed to talk about women. So like I'm not upset with that. But it kind of didn't come back until 2020. It started to come back up, right? And now we have George Floyd, and now we're back to that, and we're not talking about women anymore, right? It's a little bit frustrating to look at the way that the dialogues sort of preempt each other. And I think companies really need to figure out how to sustain all of those conversations internally, because all of those communities are frustrated.
Yeah, and to your point, to give a shout out to the name of this series, Intersection, right? I mean, because the conversations about women were dominated primarily by the experiences of white women, right? So, groups, especially groups that intersect between some of these marginalized communities, I mean, they're getting really, really lost in the shuffle. Charles, I would love to sort of get your take on, is there a reckoning around what we can expect from companies in terms of solving some social goals?
I think what Syreeta said was really powerful. I just want to acknowledge that. I think it was really well said. I think people are going to end up with diminished expectations for what companies can deliver. And I think we're ultimately going to end back up where we kind of started, which is activism. I think people are going to realize that like companies, when push comes to shove, will do things that are in their commercial interest or of interest to the founders, which I think are sort of the two big categories that I think motivate companies, either because of your shareholders or because of like personal founder interests. And I think people are going to realize that like companies, while they can be responsive to a point to very specific things, are not the place where you're going to get necessarily broader social change. And I actually think we're probably going to end up with like renewed activism on the political front. I think people are going to conclude that is the one venue where you might actually get relief.
So I would maybe closing on, Charles, I'll ask you first, like if you have a portfolio company that comes to you and says, look, like I care about these issues, but it is really difficult to talk about them. Syreeta, again, to the story you gave, right? I mean, you were an empowered person at your organization, and it was so difficult for you that, imagine being someone who is starting out in their career, right? Or just someone who doesn't have allies within the organization. How would you recommend that we can build in these conversations and these discussions in a sustainable way, and so that there aren't these icky feelings afterwards, right? Like there isn't this sense of, well, so this group had their day in the sun. Well, what about me and my grievances? And one of the things that, a popular way that this conversation tends to evolve is there are other types of diversity, right? And this reminder that, well, there's I have agency leaders tell me, well, I hired somebody from Montana, and I think that's diversity because, we're in New York, and, that's a new perspective. Or I hired a conservative, and, we're a pretty liberal organization. So like, how do we keep the conversation focused on the historically marginalized groups, and B, how do we keep it sustainable? So Charles, what advice would you give?
I think there's a generation of founders who just believe that they want companies that reflect their values, and their values are inclusive. And I think they are outcome oriented. And so I'm like not as concerned about the generation of companies that I see coming up as I am about the companies that exist today. I really, and the reason I'm not as I'm not like without concern, to be clear, Aarti, but I hear them talk about this more from a mind of like, well, this is the kind of company that I believe I want to create, not like, well, we got to have some women around here so that we have women on the website so that people like, it's not this like cynical, like, how do we check the box and move on? It's coming from a place of a belief that this is like unjust. I think a lot of what holds companies back is people come to these conversations without the vocabulary and experience about how to navigate them. And I think people are deathly afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the wrong thing is probably how they honestly feel.
Yeah.
And like, there's this process of like, how do you create space for people to express uninformed or potentially dangerously naive ideas without feeling the content? And how do you also not put the burden of that on the 3 or 4 people of color in your company to educate the whole company for free, usually, on these like historical issues? And to me, it's a social failure that there's so many people who come to the table in their 30s and 40s unable to understand why we're taking down statues of Robert E. Lee that were not put up during the Confederacy, they were put up during Reconstruction, or like during Jim Crow. Like the fact that people can't wrap their head around some of these ideas. Companies aren't wrong. These are fraught, dangerous topics. And I think there's a legitimate fear that if we allow these conversations to blossom, it's going to get real messy real fast. And how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's gotten real messy?
And Charles, and you're someone again who has a platform and is empowered. Do you hear from folks who aren't, who don't have your stature in Silicon Valley, and they say, hey, look, I can't say what you're saying at my organization. I would be iced out, or my job would be in jeopardy.
All the time. Yeah, all the time.
Syreeta, did you want to close on any thoughts? What would you advise your portfolio of PR companies, or not PR companies, your portfolio of companies as a PR professional?
Yeah, I will say, especially over the past year, we've had a lot of companies come to us looking for sort of PR support around DE&I initiatives. And we are very careful to always counsel them to, okay, before we start banging a drum about, and putting more people of color on the website, although bless you, put more people of color on the website, but let's really take a thoughtful look at your practices. Let's take a thoughtful look at your culture. What are the things that you can do internally to drive change, to build community, and make sure that this isn't just a public relations practice, right? And I think people are often surprised to hear that from a PR firm, right? That we're not going to just take your money and go tell a story, but we view ourselves as an extension of our clients. And so we're trying to help promote change, and change in the right direction.
I mean, you're so spot on. Like, PR should not just be about communication. It should be about impacting policy, right? And being able to say, hey, if we want our reputation to get better, here are the policies that we need to implement. Here are the policies we need to change. That's what reputation is. It really should be about what companies do, not what they say, right? So
I always tell I have executives that want to be thought leaders, and I always say, like, if you want to be a thought leader, first you have to think something.
Yes. Well, and Charles, this was such a great conversation. I feel like I feel like we just started it, and that I hope that maybe at some point we can revisit this, and maybe we will document some change and reflect on that. But in the meantime, thank you again for both of your time.
Anytime.
Thank you.
And we will be back soon with another episode of the PRovoke Media podcast.